Thank you again, and greetings, Tansei, Anin, Kwe, Masiabana Nis. Bonjour. It is an honor to be here with you on the Treaty Fort territory. And firstly, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the drum and the amazing work of the Whitefish Junior drummers that together with Elder Buffalo for the prayer that really did help us start this assembly in a very good way. It is, I want to acknowledge all the chiefs and the council members, the elders, the youth, the veterans, my fellow cabinet ministers, Jody and Ralph, and to have Andrew Scheer here and Jasmeet Singh and Romeo Saganash. It's really important that we work together on this journey of reconciliation together. I think today we want to acknowledge the BC First Nations who have been dislocated from their lands and their homes because of the wildfires. We want to lift up the courageous efforts of those First Nations helping on the front lines, fighting the fires, protecting your lands and opening your communities and your hearts to those who have had to leave their homes and their communities. We want you to know that we are all with you and that we are committed to help you quickly rebuild. And we will also work with you to better protect your communities going forward. This afternoon, I'd like to start with a quote from the visionary Chief Poundmaker. Seems quite fitting, as I understand that some of Chief Poundmaker's belongings have just found their way home. Here is what the chief said about looking ahead, but not pausing too long. We all know the story about the man who sat by the trail too long, and then it grew over, and he could never find his way again. We can never forget what has happened, but we cannot go back, nor can we just sit beside the trail. I'm going to spare you the usual speech outlining the list of historic and amazing investments and all of the steps that we have taken in this journey of the last year and a half on this shared journey of reconciliation. Instead, I want us to look further down the trail. We have an opportunity to make history together. We have an obligation to our children and their children and grandchildren to set out an ambitious vision, to take bold steps and think in new ways. Acclaimed novelist Tracy Lindbergh, when she came to Parliament Hill for Indigenous reads, said, "I find the part of reconciliation really hard, because I think that perhaps this isn't about going to a place we've been before, but perhaps this is about going to some place we've never been. We must listen to your ancestors and right the wrongs together. And then together, we need to chart a new trail that, as Tracy has said, is someplace we've never been." Reconciliation for our government has three parts: closing the gaps, resetting the relationship based on a recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership, and working every day to achieve that essential goal of self-determination. So I'm going to start with a few questions which build on the remarks from my friend and colleague, the Minister of Justice. In 10 years, how many of you will still be under the Indian Act? How many of you will be part of reconstituted self-governing nations? How many of you see self-determination in your future? During some consultations in North Winnipeg, a resident asked a very interesting question. Why is it that poor people have programs and the middle class has institutions. He was right. Canada must get out of the business of delivering programs to Indigenous people. We must work with you to build Indigenous-led institutions and First Nations self-governments. Self-government brings benefits to First Nations communities. The evidence shows it. Communities' well-being scores increase significantly for residents of self-governing First Nations. People have better housing, more jobs, and higher incomes in these communities. When people are involved in the decisions affecting their communities, there are better outcomes. In Sweden, the #1 health goal is civic participation. It makes sense. Full participation in decisions and the policies that affect you increase your sense of control and your resilience, and it happens to actually be good for your health. Over 10 years ago, researchers Chandler and Lalonde in BC showed that youth suicides dropped in First Nation communities that had cultural continuity, a link to tradition and culture. Since then, we've seen that in communities that are grounded in their ceremonies and spirituality and that have control over their healthcare and education and justice systems, youth mental health improves. This is the starting point. Children need hope. They need to know that they are valued. They need to know, as you've chosen the title for this assembly, that they are indeed our priority, our future. Yesterday at the AFN Youth Council, those inspiring young people talked to us about their calls to action on life promotion. Concrete recommendations for governments on how to stop this tragedy. The young people and the youth want to be part of the solutions. They want to be part of building capacity in their communities. They want to increase the skills of all young people on life promotion, how you identify suicidal ideation, being able to say the right things, to get their friends, to access the appropriate help. They asked us to focus on the assets in communities, not just focus on the deficits. They asked us to shine a light on the strengths in their communities and build from those. Every single one of them demonstrated their expertise and their lived experience. We need to listen to them. Meeting with youth councils coast to coast to coast, one hears the urgent need for land-based programming and language immersion. They understand the importance of the secure personal cultural identity. The pride of being an Indigenous person leads to better health, education, and economic outcomes. There's one area that's extraordinarily critical right now that we need to work together on, and that is child welfare. Or more accurately put, the rights and well-being of Indigenous children. It was the first 5 of the calls to action in the TRC. The statistics are appalling, and you know them as well as I do, probably better. Our heart breaks every time a child is taken from your communities. Our shared goal is to ensure that children get the very best start in life. It means we have to prevent children and their families from entering the system in the first place. It means we have to dismantle the child welfare industry. A focus on children's well-being means that dollars need to go to kids and families and communities, not to lawyers and agencies and non-Indigenous foster parents. First Nations, not federal and provincial or territorial governments, need to have the jurisdiction in family and child and family services wherever the children live. Last month, I met with Granny and knowledge keeper Catherine Whitecloud of the Dakota Nation, with other members of the Manitoba Grandmothers Circle. Catherine is a member of the National Advisory Council on Child Welfare Reform. She is also working with Cora Morgan at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs on a federally funded proposal that would empower the grandmothers to ensure that children are raised in their community with their language and culture. Cora Morgan and AMC already have instituted the Moccasin Project, in which they are on call for any Indigenous child being apprehended, no matter what time of day or night. It could be 2 a.m. They arrive and put a tiny pair of moccasins on the baby's feet before it leaves the hospital. Every child begins their life's journey as an Indigenous child. Those moccasins that Cora gave me sit in my office on my cedar boughs every day to remind us what we've got to do together. Catherine and Cora and the grandmothers are calling out the perverse incentives, the existing funding models that incentivize taking children into care. They pointed out to me that this also inhibits children from being returned to their communities, as the agency would lose funding if that happened. As FSIN Vice Chief Bear said yesterday, the present system is not working in the best interest of our children. And as I have said before, we need to prevent children and families from entering the system at all. This is the reform work that is happening at the tripartite tables across the country. Only communities know the homes that are healthy. Which auntie or cousin could be asked to look after the children while the parents seek healing? Prevention dollars need to go to communities. We are committed to working with you to make the changes necessary to create a system for children's rights and well-being. Indigenous children have a right to be raised as Indigenous people. Foster parenting can no longer be used as steady revenue for non-Indigenous families. As Dr. Evan Adams, the Chief Medical Officer at the First Nations Health Authority, has stated, a child apprehended at birth lives 20 years less. These policies and apprehensions have to stop. We want to work with you to support community-driven solutions for reform. And yesterday I was pleased to sign an accord with FSIN, which supports their vision of jurisdiction and governance models for child and family services. Over the next few months, we will advance additional projects like these across the country in full partnership with First Nations communities. And we will continue to advance progress at our tripartite tables on the comprehensive reforms that are necessary. Throughout the pre-inquiry in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, time and time again, we heard about the effects of childhood sexual violence and the attachment to the child welfare system in the experience of both the victims and the perpetrators. Hurt people hurt people. They also hurt themselves. We talk about intergenerational trauma, but we have to name it, and we have to get people the healing they need. A hugely important tool in breaking the cycle of violence is culture and ceremony, making sure individuals and communities are grounded, creating and celebrating that secure sense of personal and cultural identity that is resilience. We also must do more to support First Nations to build capacity in their communities. Comprehensive community plans, or CCPs, are not just about infrastructure and housing and water. They're about First Nations planning community development in a way that meets your needs and aspirations in all areas of community life. The quality of life of your youth, your elders, the pregnant young women, the young men who have not yet been successful at school. 162 First Nations are already reaping the benefits of CCPs. Community-led planning is at the heart of what we are trying to achieve. When elders and youth and the women's circle, the school principals, the social workers, the nurse and the police chief come together with chief and council, good things happen. Strengths can be identified and built upon. Priorities and timelines are established, and the community buys into the plan and holds the leadership accountable. The ability for communities to do long-term planning is at the heart of how we are going to go about building this new fiscal relationship. And it is at the heart of self-determination. Canada takes this journey of reconciliation very seriously. As the Prime Minister says, renewing the relationship between Canada and Indigenous people is a sacred obligation. Canada will work in partnership with First Nations to identify and meaningfully address harms that have resulted from colonization and the dispossession of your lands, territories, and resources. Part of that journey is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I want to thank Grand Chief Ed John, Willie Littlechild, Romeo Saganash, and the many Canadians who worked for years to realize the vision of that declaration, whose 10th anniversary will be celebrated this September in New York. As Grand Chief Littlechild reminds us that implementing the UN Declaration is reconciliation. In direct response to the declaration, as you heard from the Minister of Justice this morning, Canada is reviewing the federal laws and policies impacting Indigenous people. As Minister Wilson-Raybould explained, our government is committed to working with Indigenous people to change the laws and policies that were designed and written in a paternalistic and colonial way. It means that our laws will reflect Canada's constitutional obligations to treaty and Aboriginal rights and align with the Declaration. This is about breathing life into Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, which formally entrenches the rights of Indigenous people in Canadian law, and yet for far too long has not been lived up to. And as the Minister of Justice said this morning, this is a full box of rights. Supporting self-determination for First Nations involves several important aspects. The new fiscal relationship, which helps to close the socioeconomic gaps, aggregation, and building on assets already in your communities. Last year, the National Chief and I signed an MOU on a process to determine a new fiscal relationship between First Nations and Canada. Today, as you know, we announced concrete actions that have resulted from that agreement and all the hard work that was done at that table. So together we're fixing two long-standing issues. First, the opportunity to carry forward and access unexpended funding will be expanded. And the second is INEC's policy on operations and maintenance, which was introduced almost 20 years ago. This policy is outdated and simply does not reflect the realities First Nations communities face. Together with the AFN, we are identifying options for a new policy framework that is co-developed and which removes the inequalities of the current policy, which has directly contributed to the socioeconomic gap in many communities. Our plan is to put forward this plan and these options this coming December. These changes represent a critical and long overdue shift in the way we do things. In addition, as requested by self-governing First Nations, we have declared a full moratorium on the government's similarly punitive own source revenue policy as we co-develop a new fiscal relationship and new policy with those communities. This also was long overdue. The OSR clawback served as a punitive measure to communities and was a deterrent to conversations on moving to self-determination. So I often get asked, what does nation-to-nation relationship look like? And as you know, and as the Minister of Justice said this morning, that we have to answer honestly, it's not up to us to decide. It's up to First Nations to decide who comes to the table and how, whether by treaty, geography, or language, or culture. Often I get told to go and reread RCAP and the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. I want to assure you that I reread it and I will continue to reread it. I am reminded every time about the importance of a report so grounded in community, so much about Indigenous leadership of asking, not telling. When listening to the youth and the elders and the women, they are worried about breaking out of comfort zones, taking risk. As is said, wanting to comfort the afflicted, but also afflict the comfortable. Nudge those who seem to be a little bit too comfortable with the status quo. As Inuvialu leader Nellie Cornway said in 1975, paternalism has been a total failure. I couldn't agree more. And it was interesting earlier in the month as Chief Lee Crowchild said to me that he didn't particularly like the word decolonizing because he felt that what we really had to do was deprogram both sides, deprogram out of the cult of paternalism. Breaking out of the cult of paternalism can only happen when the voices of women and youth and elders are heard in the structures of power, and that includes First Nation structures.
When I had my meeting yesterday with the Women's Council, it seemed obvious to me that the voice of Native women will be an important index to determine the progress of decolonization.
Meeting with your Women's Council, it was clear that increasing the voices of Indigenous women will be a very important metric in assessing progress in decolonizing. From the settlers only speaking to men to the Indian Act and the intergenerational trauma of residential schools, women were displaced as leaders. The Indigenous women leaders are now in the forefront of turning around the tragedy of violence against women, focused on the healing needed in their communities, which must include the men and the boys. We thank them for their ongoing support of the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and for their ongoing advocacy. We also want to get out of the industry that's been built around programs. This includes getting rid of third-party managers and consultants and what Dr. Alika LaFontaine calls the non-Indigenous outside voices who keep peddling a silver bullet that will fix everything. You have been very clear. Resources need to be focused in communities with families, on the land programming, capacity building, language immersion, better schools, and great Indigenous teachers. Not on consultants helping you deal with broken government systems with too much red tape and unrealistic deadlines. We need to break out of this status quo industry. Youth want to work with elders to be part of the architects of their own future, building their own institutions and working toward self-determination. It was clear at the working group last week that many voices said youth do not want to be part of a status quo industry. It is the key that strong, that First Nations-led education systems is, as Murray Sinclair says, it was education that got us into this mess, and it'll be education that will get us out to this mess. I remember being in southwestern Ontario for the ceremony last summer with Minister Sajjan, returning the land at Isperwash that had been taken during World War II. When I visited the school there, I was so impressed with the quality of the essay writing course, the language fluency of the youth, but particularly one teacher who said to me, "I used to be a good teacher, but now I know I'm a great teacher." As you know, the Kettle and Stony Point First Nation and Walpole Island First Nation, they have children with better literacy rates than in the rest of Ontario, thanks to their model school literacy project. In the words of Dr. Nora Murdoch from the Inspiring Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Council, it will take some time and rethinking of how we do education for First Nations. What's important is looking at how First Nations-led education can have better outcomes. Indigenous pedagogy of learning by doing, summer emergent programming, granting credits, youth off for goose break in the spring and moose break in the fall. 20 years ago, Mi'kmaq decided to take over the education system in Nova Scotia. They had a 30% high school graduation rate at that time. Last evening, Chief Leroy told us that that's when he decided he wanted to be a teacher because of that initiative. MK now has a high school graduation rate of 87%, which is higher than that of the non-Indigenous population in Canada. First Nations control over First Nation education works. I and many others are truly inspired by the power of Indigenous tourism and sharing of Indigenous culture as well. As the Mississaugas of the Credit Elder Peter Schuler said at a consultation with Minister Freeland, you can sell a canoe trip 40 times. Indigenous communities are also capitalizing on tourism opportunities and creating thriving businesses that the young people are so proud to be part of. I was thrilled to see the documentary on the Carcross-Tagish First Nation mountain bike trails in the Yukon. The youth have built trails out of old hunting paths and turned them into one of the most popular mountain biking destinations in the world. Every Friday, the paths are closed so that youth can ride them and determine the areas in need of repair. They have a sense of ownership and pride as they know they are part of building economic opportunity for the whole community. I loved learning at the Sauk Nation about their prosperous oyster farming, providing seed oysters to other communities, and the Wasabi Greenhouse Project, which supplies Vancouver restaurants, and the Harvest the Solar Energy. They're providing free electricity for plug-in cars at the band office. From the hunting and fishing and gathering projects in Kluane First Nation in the Yukon, to the new chicken and vegetable farming in Garden Hill, it's really exciting to see traditional ways with innovative new approaches to tackle the pressing issues of food security in remote and rural communities. I want to end with two thoughts. First, we want to partner with you on building on the strengths and assets you already have in your communities. You have the power to determine the future of your communities. We are here to help you do what you know you need to do. We are committed to help you build First Nation-led institutions and First Nation-led governments. And as I've said to you many times before, we want you to come to the table and we want to stay out of court. And last, I want to leave you with a message of hope, and it's about youth. As the Prime Minister says, the youth are not only our future, they are our present. Today, Indigenous youth are aspiring to develop a strong personal cultural identity and to walk in both worlds, as Chief Dan George said. So, in closing, I want us to remember Chief Poundmaker's trail. But I also want to remind you about my trip with the youth from La Loche last summer on the North Saskatchewan River. You've all heard this story before. We paddled for 3 hours. Very shortly thereafter, we beached this canoe on this huge rock, and I was paddling bow, and I don't like paddling bow, but it was my fault. We had to get out and walk our canoe through water too shallow to paddle, but the current was with us, and we got to our destination. I'm here today to say the current is with us. We need to use this historic opportunity wisely and boldly. When we hit a rock, we have to move the weight around and float the canoe back into the water. We can't give up and say, see, we always hit a rock. We have to think our way through the shallow water. Everyone gets out and walks the canoe into the deeper water. I'm looking forward to walking this trail with you and paddling this river with you. The strong current is going to get us to this new place in our relationship. Canadians want this to work. They want to help. And they, like all of us, want to confront and end the systemic racism towards Indigenous people that still exists in our society and our institutions. And we need to bring them along with us as allies on this journey of reconciliation. Max Fine-Day at Canadian Roots inspires us with his quote of the amazing numbers of polling of 87% of non-Indigenous youth who think they will see reconciliation in their lifetime. You have chosen the theme of your conference well. Our priority, our children, our future. With your committed leadership, together we can get this done. Your children and grandchildren and my children and grandchildren will thank us. Together we can and will clear Poundmaker's trail so that nation to nation is something we live and breathe within our lifetime. Thank you. Merci, Chimigwich, Masi Cho, hi hi.